Again, thank you for making those of you who are looking forward to Green Build next week. Everyone's pretty busy getting ready to go, so thanks for taking the time. And the reason we're having it so close to Green Build is that it really is a prelude to Green Build for us, because we look forward to having conversations with those of you who will be there about creating transparency as we grow closer. Implementation, VB3 cutoff later in 2016. So today's webcast will be sharing with you really the technical process of how we created a transparency report and ensure that it is an ISO 14025 type. Further, how we created our framework and use that framework from our program to analyze any other program, to look at the similarities and differences between requirements in the PCR and in the LCA, so that we can produce a transparency report based on the LCA requirements in any existing PCR. The reason that we're doing that is, here's our theme, is our investing in product transparency, and to make that information understandable and accessible to people who care about that information, and make it easy to understand and find all in one place with all the other information you need to find about products. So I'd like to start out to talk a little bit about who is Sustainable Minds for those of you who this landscape of PCRs, LCAs, and EPDs. And I'd like to start out by saying that we're a software company. And we've been a software company since our inception 8 years ago. And we started out delivering eco-design and LCA software in the cloud to help manufacturers design LCA software tool, but unlike theirs, because ours is purpose-built for manufacturers to use in early-stage product development to be able to model and run competing scenarios and understand where trade-offs can be made to make higher-performing products. Sustainable Minds software is not a tool that can be used to do a full LCA that you're going to need to do as the background report for a Type 3 environmental declaration. Added program operator to our business model so that we could credibly operate an ISO 14025 program. So we are not only a program operator, it's simply part of our business, and everything that we do is about ease of use, delivery in the cloud, and really helping manufacturers and their customers make information environmental and much more accessible. So the way we scale in the industry is by collaborating with all other service providers. So every LCA provider, when they are ready to deliver a Type 3 environmental declaration for their client, they have a choice. They can offer a traditional EPD, or they can offer a transparency report. It's simply the choice of the manufacturer. The LCA provider collaborate with other program operators, because you can see in this slide, we chose not to be in the certification business. We think there are other program operators who are much better at that, and not an expertise we care to develop. And also it allows us to have a wider group of collaborators to work with. So that's where we fit in the landscape. And here's really our big idea about how manufacturers can make and market greener products, which is that it's all part of one continuous improvement loop, and the manufacturer can start wherever they like. They can start by designing greener, actually making something that has performance improvements, and then going to report and market in the industry. Or in response to today's demand for transparency, a manufacturer can start that way. And so our products fit around, our products and services can fit around this loop. Here's our transparency program documents. So I need product transparency. Here's a great program we're going to dive into. From this, you develop your LCA. These are the rules. We're really going to talk about that. From that, you develop your transparency reports, which we deliver to the marketplace in the manufacturer's showroom, which is freely available in the cloud for everybody to use. And then we provide the LCA data back to the manufacturer in our cloud LCA and eco-design software tool, so that the manufacturer's product development teams now have their actual data and the interpretation from the full LCA, and can use that to measure, model, and compare, look for new improvements, and ultimately, when you go back out to report again, now you have performance improvements that you can demonstrate and talk about. And by the way, there was a new credit added to Lead V4 over the summer for demonstrating continuous improvement. So this is going to be something that the market's going to be looking to as we go forward. So this idea about moving from disclosure to brand value really just has to do with words. And we know from the political landscape over the last few years, the idea of framing became very important. And really this is simply that, which is reframing what it is that we're doing. The word disclosure doesn't really invigorate somebody to want to do that, given that it really doesn't have positive connotations. But product transparency absolutely can be reframed into something extremely valuable and extremely positive. We believe that product transparency builds credibly greener brands. And the way that a manufacturer really leverages that value for providing their product transparency information is to demonstrate that they actually understand what it means, and they're doing something with it, either in the design or the manufacturer or some life cycle stage or stages, their products, and that they can tell meaningful stories about how that environmental performance information informs the way they make and deliver products. So from the user's perspective, people making decisions about purchasing greener products need to have that information made understandable to them, and further, that it's meaningful. Not just, do I technically understand what it means? Do I technically understand the data? But how do you put that in a context so that I can make meaning from that to inform a decision? When a manufacturer can do that, they're telling great stories that build powerful brands, and powerful brands create preference and value for their companies. So today, we're talking about our compatibility process, making transparency reports that are compatible with any existing PCR. We kind of like this idea of liberating manufacturers from having only one choice, which is a traditional technical disclosure. If manufacturers are going to embrace product transparency and improve the quality of their products, then product transparency has to do more heavy lifting for those manufacturers. And so the ability to use it to market and sell is very powerful. Our compatibility process is something that we have been working on for quite some time, so that manufacturers who do make the choice of transparency reports versus traditional EPDs can assure the market that the LCA rules, all the calculations are done according to the PCR that everyone else is using in the industry. Only the resulting deliverable is different. Now you have a choice. So today we're going to talk about how we use a ULE PCR for sanitary ceramics to create a laboratory sync transparency report with Toto. Now that sounds like it might be simple, but actually there's quite a lot of technical background detail, and for those of you, many if not most of you on today's webcast are designers or are in the sustainability industry, you know that to get to something simple requires an enormous amount of iteration to simplify the complexity. What I'm going to do is take you through an overview of literally 2 years of work to get to this point. So I'm going to start out by talking to you about the Transparency Report framework and program and how we developed the Transparency Report in the first place. We'll talk a little bit about our two-part PCR. What is unique about our Part B is that what drives the development of our Part Bs are the functional performance of the product, not materials. And we'll show you what we mean by that. And our framework has been designed for continuous improvement and harmonization. So we're going to talk about that too, because as the industry evolves, so should the requirements for product transparency, rather than locking in rules that don't necessarily work for everyone or include the latest consensus in the industry. So we'll cover the original inception and research we did to inform the content in a transparency report. We'll give you a quick tour of a transparency report, so that's all kind of level setting. Here's what we're doing now. And then we'll take a look at the ULE PCR and their Part B for sanitary ceramics, which includes lavatory sinks. And then we're going to take you to the kind of the key work we did recently, which is the compatibility process, where we not only compared the content requirements from the ULE PCR to the Transparency Report framework content requirements, we also took a look at a ULE EPD for lavatory sinks, so we could understand how those content requirements were implemented in their EPD. And additionally, we added an evaluation and a comparison to the ULE USGBC EPD guidance that was recently published. And then we're finally going to show you a solution for how we're creating compatible transparency reports. And the last part of it is we're going to share with you some of the learnings and the discussion questions that came up in this process that I'm really going to kind of open up to the industry, and hope that we can start a meaningful conversation that will result in more than just conversation, but real action. So going back a few years, I'm going to say 3, we were down in Atlanta at the Toto manufacturing facility, and we were asked to give a workshop to folks at Toto about the impending product transparency processes that were going to be happening there and in the industry, and to decode these acronyms, the alphabet soup of this industry. And so Ute Meyer, our LCA technical expert, and I did a unbundling of this technical information, broke it down into language that regular people would understand. And I'd also like to acknowledge that Ute was one of the authors of the EPD credit language in Lead V4, and so was very conscious of the impacts that that credit was going to have in the marketplace. So these are a couple of the slides from the presentation and that we've used since then, where we explained what is an EPD, and that ISO 14025 that describes the requirements for Type 3 environmental declarations describes that there are 4 main categories of content that get included in an EPD. You get there are LCA results, additional information to explain any variability that would drive performance, any other environmental performance data that isn't covered in the LCA that's important or relevant to report on environmental performance. And then the last category is, paraphrasing here, literally whatever else the manufacturer wants to tell, as long as it's relevant to the product and the environmental performance information that's being supplied. And then finally, EPDs need to be certified by a third party, and here's a list of some of the third parties that do that. So we did, again, this research is about 3 years old. We identified a variety of EPDs. We wanted to look at documents from different product categories, different geographic locations, and even things that weren't EPDs but were being utilized by manufacturers to deliver their environmental performance information. So we identified those EPDs, and we created really an analysis framework where we took the EPD content categories, made them just a little bit more granular. We added product description and issuing party related references, and we went through each of these EPDs page by page to identify what content type was in each of these documents, and so that we could, by zooming out, what you're seeing here is kind of the preponderance of content in each of these different EPDs. Some of them were 15 pages long, one was 20 pages long, one was 3. So very, very disparate lengths, and lots and lots. Go back to the color coding. LCA results is pink. Relevant variations is purple. You can see a lot of pink and purple, especially here in this handheld shower one. These are the shorter ones, where here is the transparency brief when it first came out, so not an EPD, but an executive summary. The EPD is somewhere else. And finally, this example EPD from the Netherlands for an insulation company that actually was 4 pages with a range of content type. And so to summarize our research findings, we said, most EPDs are just too long and not really useful to inform a purchase decision. The really short ones, with the exception of the Dutch EPD, if they were too short, they weren't EPDs. They're mostly too technical, too much technical detail in the LCA results, too much other environmental data that was also confusing, little to no marketing information, or that the technical information distracted from the marketing information or product-specific information. Obviously, they're not comparable, and it really just kind of highlighted the question for us is, how will an architect, builder, or contractor ever use these to make a purchase decision? So our high-level research conclusions were, at that point in time, look, the existing PCR EPD process was not going to be scalable enough to keep up with the demand for transparency that was likely to ensue now with the V4 credit language. And so these are the 6 parameters that we put in place to kind of set the goals for our program, that we said, fixing one part of the solution, either the PCR or the EPD or the LCA, isn't going to fix the system. We need to look at a comprehensive solution. We're going to use design to help make the complex clear. By the way, that's my background. I was once a graphic designer, so with Yoop and I being the creators of the program, bringing many years of both LCA technical expertise and information and visual design, you'll see how the result of those skills has played out. We also said we've got to be able to provide real advantages over how things are done today, because what's the motivation for anyone to do anything differently? We also said we've got to allow for continual improvement, again, based on stakeholder engagement, what they learn, trends in the industry, kind of continual harmonization, and really focus on the benefits the solution provides to each stakeholder. At the end of the day, the greatest benefit is the report. It's how the information gets delivered to the end user. So the PCR, the LCA, or now I'm also kind of acknowledging the material assessment space, all of that is a means to an end, to get information that's salient and relevant into a report, into the hands of people who are going to make decisions. So our motto was, let's keep the science. No one's debating that LCA isn't the best method for measuring the relative greenness of products and systems, but let's re-engineer the process. So what we did was we created our own content requirements for the transparency report, and a little bit later you'll see this actually is our Appendix C to our PCR Part A, where now you can see the evolution of that, the color coding even. We went back to each of the categories that we evaluated for. We went back through all the research that we did, looking at the EPDs and what really worked about all of them, because all the ones we looked at had really great things going on somewhere in them, and then there were other things that didn't work at all. So we tried to take kind of the best ideas from each of the EPDs we studied and created a very, very specific list of content requirements in each of the required categories to create a Type 3 environmental declaration. And most importantly, we were very rigorous in what we included in the LCA results section. We said any LCA information that's included in the transparency report must pass the test. People understand the environmental impacts of the product and how the manufacturer could make the product better. So the real purpose for the LCA, right, is for the manufacturer to understand impacts and find out where they can make improvements. And we're bringing that same thinking, that same set of guidelines to the transparency report. So here's the transparency report. It's our brand of EPD. Now, again, you can create it from any PCR. And it's all about helping manufacturers leverage their investment in LCA and effectively present a greener brand. And I throw this slide in just to point out that ISO 14025 on the first page of the report says a program operator can call their Type 3 environmental declarations anything they like. We called ours transparency reports so that we could talk about how what we're doing is different than the things that are referred to as EPDs, which is an example of something they can be called, not the thing they are called. The actual thing is a Type 3 environmental declaration. So you'll see me use that phrase. So the full transparency report program is a systemic solution. We created a new approach to developing PCRs with a standardized framework so that manufacturers can create PCRs at the product group level for greater specificity around performance and the resulting LCA results relative to products that deliver the same performance. The transparency report is a marketing tool that allows for extensibility. Recently, we introduced our material health overview. Now a manufacturer can add material ingredient reporting. Next year we'll be adding water footprinting, carbon footprinting, and so there will be building blocks of environmental reporting that manufacturers can choose to include and choose their own methods when there is a choice, or use one method that the industry agrees is the method that they would like to see utilized for comparability. And then finally, this idea of helping to design greener is really a key component to drive that continuous improvement loop. So one of the most important things that Yup and I committed to in the design of the transparency reports was it would be short. Nobody has a lot of time to read. Nobody wants to look through 10, 15, 20 pages. We committed to doing it in 3 pages, and page 3 is optional. So we decided that everything somebody would need to make a purchase decision needed to be on page 1. All of the LCA results and interpretation would be on page 2, with a real focus on very simple presentation of the scope and the parameters of the LCA, very simple interpretation language. The manufacturer right here can start talking about the programs they're implementing to drive improvements. Very simple representation of the full LCA results, and I'll show you a blow-up of that in just a minute. Even including captions for what's contributing greater than 20% of the impacts in each life cycle stage, so that someone can read it up here, they can glance at it down here, and behind this purple bar in the real recorder, the full LCA results with all the reference language, the rating system info. And page 3 is how we make it greener. This is where the manufacturer gets to actually talk about and show through any combination of pictures and text what they're doing in each life cycle stage that's contributing to those performance improvements. So I'm going to break page 2 down by the zones on the page. We've got the scope, the attributes, and the summary of the LCA. We've got the interpretation and some of the explanation for what's going on. This is the detailed data and results zone. And then we've got the references, links to information sources, and rating systems. I'm just going to zoom on this for one moment because the transparency report framework uses EN 15804 as one of the basis for the program. EN 15804 uses a modular LCA approach using these 3 system boundary scopes. And so you have these life cycle stages with information modules within each one. So when you do a cradle-to-gate LCA, you're going to report on these 3 modules, which are required. When you do cradle-to-grave, all of these modules then are also required to be able to make the cradle-to-grave claim, and cradle-to-gate with options allow the manufacturer to choose which life cycle stages and information modules they're going to include. So that's kind of complex right there, right? Especially for someone who has no idea of what LCA is or how it's done. So what we've tried to do is not only not have a lot of text in the transparency report, we tried as much as we could to use information design to convey a lot of the complex concepts. So what you can see here is that in a glance, someone can now see which life cycle stages were included in the LCA and which information modules were included in those life cycle stages. And just as important to what is included, we're very clear about what was excluded. And that's very important in the world of LCAs. The footer is designed to very quickly, in a glance, let the user know the level of verification. We also provide for self-declared because we think that at some point, and it is always an option, manufacturers can choose to create self-declared reports. But when they are verified and certified, very clear who's done that, and the PCR has been certified to. And lastly, on every page in the transparency report here in the footer is a link to contact the manufacturer. to make it an effective marketing tool. I'm going to keep going, and I'll do the transparency report demo at the end. I'm going to talk about the framework just a little bit. Joep Meyer is from the Netherlands and has practiced for many, many years, both in Europe and in North America. And so, and again, was one of the authors of the lead credit language, and really has a long-term view of how what's happening in Europe really needs to happen in North America, which is really simplification and unification of the programs that exist so that manufacturers and everybody can start doing things the same way. So our program is based on EN 15804 and the ISO standards for LCA, and our program documents include a Part A, which includes all the LCA calculation rules and report requirements for any product category for every LCA that gets done. It never gets rewritten when a new PCR gets created. And the Part B is a product group definition, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. Our other documents are the governance and program rules, how we operate, and then finally a number of tools for manufacturers to collect and create the data that goes into the transparency report. So it is a standardized format. So our Part A is also designed to be updated annually. So we're actually now working on Part A 2016. And so as things change in the industry, as things get learned, as the framework gets used, as the technical advisory board members bring things to our attention, those things can all get considered again by the technical advisory board and determined how to get added or not so that our Part A stays current in the industry. Our Part B is one page, and it only includes information that manufacturers would be qualified to create, with a little bit of an exception. Need some help with the functional unit. But when the Part B is performance-based, and when we talk about performance, we mean functional performance. So the definition of a product group is products that deliver the same functional performance and therefore would compete for the same specification. Now with that kind of level playing field, the manufacturer can demonstrate their advantage and their differentiation on top of that. So our Part B consists only of 3 sections. The functional performance, what performance are customers buying and how is the industry measuring it. Then the functional unit, so what is going to be the right quantified unit of this type of performance. And then any additional rules needed to help compare products within the group. So our product group definition request form is literally one page. There's the 3 sections: who's initiating. It can be initiated by one manufacturer, a group of manufacturers. They define the product group, do the research for any relevant or supporting PCRs or other literature, the functional performance, the functional unit, and rules for comparability. This is what a completed product group definition looks like. So with this Part B and Part A, that's a complete PCR. And it gives the manufacturing community a real opportunity to dig into defining a functional unit that makes sense, providing rationale for it, so that should that functional unit get revisited, we're not revisiting just a number, but revisiting the rationale. Anybody can weigh in on that. And the same thing for the additional rules for comparability. It's not just a rule statement. All of the supporting data for that scenario is captured right there in the Part B. And even nonetheless, it's still one long page. So now that you have a little bit of insight into our framework and program, we're going to take you through the comparison to the ULE PCR and the ULE, USGBC, EPD guidance document. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this guidance document, this was created by a working group organized by UL and USGBC to put some guidance around best practices for EPDs, the kind of content that they'd like to see, and with some guidance about how PCRs should be written to include this EPD content. And a lot of that information in that document has definitely been transferred from ULE's Part A. And so, just a quick comparison, ULE's PCR is also a two-part PCR, regionalized from the EBU system in Germany. Now, in contrast to our framework, while we did use EN 15804 and the ISO LCA programs, our program was written from the ground up, specific to North America, adding the additional requirements for global reporting. In this two-part PCR, the idea of product categories is how the Part Bs are written. So in this case, here's the Part B for sanitary ceramics. And I want to draw the distinction here. Our Part Bs are based on functional performance, independent of what the product is made out of. So for example, sinks can be made out of aluminum or steel or any variety stone. And therefore, this PCR would not apply to a sink made of any material other than ceramics. This is an approach to creating one kind of aggregate document for all sanitary products made out of ceramics. We think we actually have an approach that serves the needs of manufacturers and the users of environmental performance information a little bit better. In the Part B, there is one page that lists some product-specific attributes for the use and the maintenance phases. So this is the only reference to lavatory sinks in the entire PCR in Part B. So here's what we did. We took our Appendix C, the content framework, and said, all right, here's that content framework. You were familiar with it. The way we wrote it was the content requirements also include descriptions of what the information has to be able to communicate for it to be good, not just the information itself. And I'm going to just jump to that document for a moment. What we did was we went through the entire ULE Part A and Part B and identified where in that PCR were content requirements that we hadn't already included in our transparency report framework. And it turned out that there really wasn't a lot different in the other categories, like variations that drive performance or relevant additional information, because there's actually not any mention of those topics in that PCR uniquely. But there was a lot of variability, and there's a lot of differences in the LCA section. And so that was surprising to us, because we believed that the Part A's were fairly similar. And the actual calculation rules are similar. In fact, almost the same. What it turns out is that there's just a lot more content and LCA calculation rules, not only required in the report, but in the LCA itself. So what we did was we went back to an LCA, an EPD that ULE had done for a lavatory sink, and we went through and looked at the way that content that we identified as additional, so additional to us, to a transparency report, how was that presented in that EPD. And so what you're seeing is the requirement from the PCR, the actual language copied and pasted out, and then how that was implemented in the EPD. You know, one of the notes that I make here is that it's pretty common to see a map in an EPD, but the PCR does not call for a map, nor does it call for a flow diagram. But a map and a flow diagram take up a good portion of a page. So now start thinking about, you know, how content is used efficiently or not in an EPD. We also kind of struck out what really wasn't relevant because of the kind of product that it was. These are Part A requirements. And I left in a few of the notes. We wrote in some action items as we were going through it about what we're going to need to do in the transparency report and go back and look at the LCA that had already been done. Now I'm going to bring this up because we're going to get to this in the end. Toto has been training internal teams to do LCAs to really integrate environmental performance into product development, and they are by far not unique. The entire building construction industry, to ultimately achieve product transparency for LEED version 4, must integrate, develop that capacity, that capability, and integrate it into the way they design and market their products. No manufacturer is going to be able to be dependent upon consultants forever, although the role of consultants are critical right now and certainly for the next few years, because it's the consultants who are doing the knowledge transfer into the manufacturers. So going back to the again, the comparison, we thought this was pretty surprising, where all of the flow parameters were required in the EPD. And that kind of raised a little bit of an eyebrow because, and particularly back to these tables, the requirement is that these tables are included even if there's no data to fill them in. The table is required to be in the EPD, even if there's nothing to report. And all of this flow information that does not report environmental impacts, because all of this information ultimately is calculated into the environmental impact information. It's in the LCA, and here it's also required to be in the EPD. So we could see if there were additional content requirements that we hadn't already identified in the UL PCR comparison. And so going through this document, it's the same framework, takes our appendix, and just a few small things indicating that that the document was used in an attempt to conform. Some additional requirements about software use, data set use, some other energy flow information, and some additional parameters, again describing flow information, and that's pretty much it. So now with all of that research under our belts and all of the different content requirements that we'd identified, you know, as I told you in the beginning, we have a commitment to making product transparency understandable and meaningful, and a requirement that we were only going to include LCA results in the body of the transparency report that informed this important parameters that support environmental impacts, what those environmental impacts mean, and what the manufacturer is doing to improve. And so using that same set of guidance for our program, we're not going to add all that additional content to the transparency report because we care about continuity and ease of use, not only for the manufacturers but for their customers. So here's our solution. The only rule we had to break for ourselves was that we could no longer limit the transparency report to 3 pages, so we would add one more, make it 4 pages. Now I know that that might seem a little disingenuous because this is a very long page. It's not an 8.5 by 11 printed page, but again, it's the value of delivering information in the cloud, on the web. Someone can scroll through this information, and by the way, we deliver a downloadable PDF in every transparency report, so this content is included in the PDF. So this page 4 includes all the additional content that's required by this ULE PCR for sanitary ceramics. So you can see here are the requirements for those flow tables, scenarios to be included. Here's the column where there's actual data. This whole section here is the data requirements section from the USGBC guidance document, although we did add a sentence to page 2 that also meets the data reporting requirements. And then here are these additional flow tables formatted in the same way as the tables are formatted on page 2 of the document. So the other thing we did is, you know, we already had places in the transparency report for this kind of information, and so as I mentioned, we inserted a few sentences here and there in the existing transparency report. And here you can see now in the references section, here's the full name of the LCA. Here's that it was done in CIMAPRO 8, which is a requirement from the USGBC guidance document to say what tool was used. Here are the references to the PCRs. Because it's in the cloud, you can actually link to those PCRs. Here's this other reference document statement, and a link to downloading the PDF so that you can get all that page 4 data. We're not building an HTML page for page 4. You can click on that, get it in the PDF, download the PDF, but it's not a primary source of data that we feel qualifies to be included in the transparency report for all the reasons that I've already told you about. So these are the kind of the big learnings and discussion questions that came out of this process. You know, we realized that once we go through a compatibility process for a PCR from any program operator, we can add an appendix to our Part A that describes the additional content requirements. And then it just becomes an easy thing to produce. But what we didn't really realize was how much work it is for the producer of the LCA to create LCAs that conform with PCRs in different programs. This is actually a huge concern, which is why I spend a little bit of time talking about it. The first couple of discussion points, I think, are a little bit obvious how we feel about the answer to this question: how much of the LCA content should be required in an EPD? What is useful to an AEC professional to make a better informed decision? But as we were going through this process, just in the last few weeks, the ACLCA PCR committee, who have created a guidance document on how to do PCRs, just created last year, wrote an open letter to the UL-USGBC working group to give them feedback on the guidance document, and included some questions like, why are you requiring a brief and an EPD that's actually not compliant with ISO guidelines? Why are you limiting impact categories? The guidance document calls for only 6 of the 10 Tracy impact categories. We believe that if Tracy is the methodology that's being used and has been agreed upon as the impact assessment method for North America, then you use all 10 impact categories. And we are firmly committed to reporting all 10 impact categories, because we don't believe it's up to us to say what should get reported or not. And some of the other guidance was in conflict with the international standards. And I meant to include the URL, but this is now an open letter and sent to Brendan, and really steps through some very, very specific and important issues that the American Center for Life Cycle Assessment has identified that was in their guidance that is in direct conflict with standards or the LCA Product Category Rule Committee, which is another indicator of the difficulties that industry, not just manufacturers, but LCA consultants face when developing LCAs for different programs. Now, I pulled out this quote from one of the folks working on the LCA, taking the LCA and the LCA report the team at Toto have implemented and have been using for the last 3 years. They've been trained to use, to create the report in a certain way, to use that template, and effectively, like every other manufacturer in the country who's trying to educate their internal team to be able to have this capability internally, if now the LCA reporting requirements, not even if now, given that LCA reporting requirements are different between programs as well as what goes into the EPD, this creates a lot of additional technical capability that these internal teams need to have just to be able to parse and understand the technical standards language. So our experience was that making the transparency report compatible to another program's PCR was not that challenging. It was a little tough to kind of figure it out the first time, but now that we understand it, it's not difficult. But it actually drove the LCA team to have to create a lot more content for the LCA, and content that would never get used in the PCR, and it would never even get used in the EPD. So it was not only just creating a lot more content, it was reformatting and reorganizing all of the information in the report. A few more difficulties, just to be specific, and again, this is all being brought up for discussion because these are some of the issues that others have brought up, and I just want to surface these for discussion. one of the requirements that is not in our framework, but in the UL PCR, was the requirement to provide all of this technical information about the data that was used, which is a manual process. And that requirement is even for data coming from legitimate databases. So non-technical people who have been taught to do LCAs for their products really have no idea about how to do quality assessments on data, particularly if it's not their own. Providing a full description of how each unit process was modeled. This is separate from the system boundary sections where model inclusions were already stated. Having to write additional interpretation, as I mentioned before, not even would this interpretation go into the EPD, and it certainly wouldn't be useful for transparency report users. And then further, if you're not someone who has delivered LCAs in compliance with UL PCRs, some of the requirement language is vague. And so, again, for the regular person at a manufacturing company doing LCAs, they're kind of either at the mercy of having to call back in the consultant or wait for the LCA reviewer to call them on kind of the lack of quality of the report as a and put it back on their plate, which means more time and delay, and they have to call the consultant to come back in and help them. So, we kind of pose this statement, if the deliverable of an LCA is an LCA report, then the EPD should be the report of the report, which it is. EPDs came into being so that manufacturers didn't have to publish the full contents of an LCA. And so, we ask the question, if it's a report of a report, why are they still so long? And it's because they're still disclosures as opposed to strategic communication tools. These are the challenges that the market faces right now going forward. What's going to have to happen to annoy the industry enough to solve these problems of different technical standards? It's annoying to the markets, the manufacturers, it's annoying to service providers, and really a lot of the way PCRs have been created and get created is, things could go wrong in the LCA, so we better be transparent, let people do their own research, let's put it in the EPD. And so even though there are organizations like the LCA, ACLCA, who have said, look, these are going to be best practices for PCRs, they don't have any authority. And while the document is out there, nobody has to comply, which is how USGBC and UL came up with their own guidance that was not inclusive of this information that was created over a year ago. So we asked the question, what do we need to do to organize in North America so that we can remove unnecessary content from EPDs? So everything the manufacturer needs to understand the impact their products are making should be in the LCA. It's the primary use of an LCA, for the manufacturer to understand and make improvements. So what do we need to organize? Certainly everybody understands that background data needs to get organized. We need to standardize on a data set or data sets that are freely available. We can't be standardizing on paid databases. And again, we really feel very strongly about the transparency report. The LCA information has to pass the test of making environmental impacts understandable and how the product is getting improved. So that's our story for today. We invite you to follow up with us. We actually answered each of the questions that people did submit. I understand that there was a little bit of challenge with the audio and visual, and I apologize for that. But Thank you for staying the course. We welcome your questions and input, and please come see us at Greenbuild if you're going to be there. So everyone, have a great day, and see you soon.